Welcome to Season 3, Episode 9 of CSS Breakdown, Book by Book. In this chapter of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, we explore the gendered landscape of the workplace, where inequality persists not just in paychecks, but in expectations, advancement, and the very structure of labor itself. So today we're taking a deep dive into this really significant text. We're getting into the world of work and maybe challenging some basic ideas many of us have.
Yeah.
Because, you look around, you see more women in more jobs than ever, right?
Yeah.
And you might think, okay, things are level now, or, getting
That's
there.
logical.
But this chapter paints a picture that's, well, a lot more complicated and frankly, pretty unequal still.
That's really the heart of it, isn't it? That tension. Because yes, the who in the workforce has changed massively. Women entering everywhere, huge demographic shift over the last century.
Undeniable.
But the surprising thing, the core point here, is that despite all that change, the workplace itself, its basic structure, it hasn't really kept up. It's still deeply gendered. And that shapes everything, expectations, who gets ahead, how people experience their jobs. And it's not just, obvious discrimination. It's baked into the way work is set up.
So it's systemic.
Exactly. It's the system everyone's working within, whether they realize it or not.
It's like peeling an onion, maybe. You think you know what work is, but underneath there's this whole other layer operating.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and understand that underlying system. We're going to trace back how work got so gendered in the first place, might challenge some traditional ideas. We'll look at the stats, the hard numbers on who's working and what they're earning, shows the scale of change, but also the inequality that's sticking around.
The numbers don't lie.
Then we'll explore the subtle stuff, the everyday ways discrimination and segregation happen.
The stuff that's often invisible.
Exactly. And we'll unpack concepts like the glass ceiling, the barrier for women, and this idea of a glass escalator for men, which is unexpected.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
We'll also touch on why these shifts might feel, well, threatening to some men.
An important piece of the puzzle.
And then, crucially, what can actually be done? What are some real remedies? Beyond just telling people to try harder.
Looking at solutions, yeah.
So it's a journey into why work isn't maybe the level playing field we assume it is, and how gender just profoundly shapes our working lives still.
All right, let's dive in.
So where do we even start with understanding gender and work? The chapter kicks off with the basics, right? Freud's idea.
Yeah, Freud's famous line, the two big tasks for humans are to work and to love. Work is fundamental. It's about providing, yes, but also meaning participation.
Being part of something.
Exactly. And every single society always has had some kind of division of labor. Someone does this, someone does that, got to get things done.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing. Looking across history, across cultures, that division is almost always gendered. Very few tasks are truly gender neutral anywhere.
Always split by gender.
Ooh.
Pretty much. And this is the really key insight, the valuing of that work. That's not automatic. That's cultural.
Meaning,
society decides if the work men typically do is worth more, is more important than the work women typically do. It's not inherent in the task itself. That's something we layer on top, a cultural decision.
Okay, that's a huge distinction. Gendered tasks, common. Unequal value for those tasks.
Yeah.
That's a choice.
Precisely. And it leads to another point. What many of us picture as traditional today, dad goes to work, mom stays home.
The classic 1950s image.
Right. That's actually, historically speaking, pretty recent, especially in America.
Really? Feels like it's been around forever.
Nope. That whole idea of separate spheres, public for men, work, politics, private for women, home, it didn't really get locked down until just before the Civil War. And even then.
Wasn't the reality for everyone?
Not at all. Many families couldn't afford it. And the specific 1950s male breadwinner female housewife model, that was really pushed in that decade, partly to get men back into jobs after WWII and encourage women who'd worked during the war to, well, go back home.
So the idea that women only recently started working outside the home, that's just wrong.
Completely wrong. Women have always worked. For money, for satisfaction, sometimes fighting just for the right to do it. And here's a kind of counterintuitive point the text makes. In some societies we might think of as more traditional, where women have lower legal status, they actually work more than men.
More.
Yeah, the data suggests maybe up to 35% more in terms of sheer time spent working.
Wow, so lower status doesn't mean less work.
Nope. can mean more work, just for less recognition or power. It really flips the script on some simple assumptions.
Okay, that historical context is crucial. Let's shift to the modern era then.
Yeah.
The huge story is just the sheer number of women entering the workforce, right? Across the 20th century and now.
Oh, absolutely massive. You can really see it if you think generationally. Like that classroom exercise described in the chapter.
Tell me get it.
You ask young women today, how many of you expect a full-time career? Basically every hand shoots up.
Right. Standard expectation now.
Then ask, okay, how many of your mothers worked full-time, say for at least 8 years straight without stopping? Fewer hands. Then ask about grandmothers.
Almost none.
Maybe just a few. It shows how dramatically expectations have shifted for women in just a couple of generations.
And meanwhile, if you ask the guys in the class, how many expect a full-time career?
It sounds like a silly question, doesn't it?
Yeah, because it's just been the expectation for men, fathers, grandfathers, back and back.
The numbers really bear this out. Men's participation rate was high, like 85% in 1900, dipped a bit to maybe 74% by the mid-2000s, but still high.
Okay.
Women's rates started low, around 20% in 1900, soared past 60% by 2005, just exploded.
And it wasn't just single women finding jobs.
No way. Married women, only 6% worked outside the home in 1900. Today, 61%.
That's a revelation.
And married women with young kids, under 6, that's maybe the most dramatic shift, only 12% worked in 1950. Less than 40 years later, nearly 2/3, 66%.
Incredible. And this is across the board, racially.
Yeah, holds true across racial and ethnic groups. There are some variations. Black women have historically had higher rates. Hispanic women may be slightly lower, but the upward trend is universal. And looking forward,
What's the projection?
the projection is that 80% of all new workers entering the labor force in the next decade or so will be women, minorities, and immigrants.
So the face of the workforce is fundamentally changing.
And women aren't just taking any jobs. They're moving into professions that were once almost exclusively male.
Like what?
Engineering, medicine, law, university teaching. Big increases in women's share since the 60s and 70s. The rise of women in management is called one of the biggest shifts since clerical work became seen as women's work way back when.
The impact on families must be huge.
Immense. That old model, the male breadwinner supporting everyone on his income alone, that was the norm in 1900. Now, it's less than 5% of families.
Wow, 5%.
The dual-earner couple is the new normal. That's just the reality.
But, as the chapter points out, our institutions, our policies, our ideas haven't really caught up, have they?
Not even close. There's that quote from a Reagan-era government report admitting workplace policies were designed for that old male breadwinner world. That lag, that disconnect, is still a huge issue.
Like cultural inertia.
Exactly. The book suggests, talking to your own family, trace the jobs back, see when women in your family maybe stopped working outside the home. Was it when they moved from a farm or out of a city neighborhood to the suburbs?
Trying to live that ideal.
Maybe, for a time. It really brings home how specific and, temporary that traditional model actually was for many people before reality shifted again.
Okay, so the workforce reality has changed, but the ideas are lagging. And this lag, this clinging to old gender ideas, has real consequences.
Absolutely. Let's talk about men first. Historically, the workplace was the place for men to prove their manhood, be the provider, the breadwinner.
The homosocial testing ground.
Right, testing themselves against other men. But there's a contradiction built in. The psychiatrist Willard Galen is quoted. He says work is vital to a man's pride, but he's never met a man who truly feels like a success deep down.
That's sobering. Even successful men feel like failures.
It points to this relentless pressure. The self-made man ideal, the need to be the main provider. It creates this treadmill. Surveys back in the 70s showed lots of men unhappy with their jobs, wishing they could slow down, spend more time with family.
That old cliche about wishing you'd spent less time at the office.
Exactly. Why feel that way in your supposed domain? Well, partly it's attitudes you bring in, like that discomfort if your wife earns more.
The Newsweek poll.
Right, 35% of men saying they'd quit or cut back if their wife out-earned them. Your identity shifts from being a worker to needing to be the earner.
And partly it's the workplace culture itself.
Yeah. Corporate life demands conformity, sacrifice. There's often not much room for talking about feelings, vulnerability. You have to fit the mold.
The chapter uses Death of a Salesman, right?
Yes, Arthur Miller. Biff and Happy Loman talking about the measly manner of existence. Always competing for what? It captures that treadmill feeling perfectly.
This pressure ties manhood to the paycheck size. to being on top.
And if you're raised to believe there are no limits, but you hit one or don't reach the very top, it feels like a personal failing as a man. You failed at work, yes, but also at being a man according to that specific ideal. Kimmel's phrase is stark. Men are unsexed by failure.
And the flip side for women? Unsexed by success.
Exactly. Traits that work for men, being assertive, ambitious, competent, can be seen as, well, unfeminine in women. They violate gender expectations.
That chemist, Gary Richmond.
Her story is so telling. Feeling she had to shed femininity dresses, makeup, even scented lotion just to be seen as a serious scientist, adjusting her gender presentation to fit in.
And then there's the idea of women as workplace lubricators.
Yeah, the emotion work in roles like secretaries or flight attendants, smoothing interactions between men, ensuring the space felt comfortable, and, the book adds, unmistakably heterosexual.
Wow. And the old idea about why women worked.
Either out of dire necessity or just for pin money, right?
Yeah.
Not serious careers, which made women feel like they should apologize for working, feel guilty about not being home.
But writers like Kate Pollitt push back.
Yes, saying, hang on, I work because I like my job, I like the money, I like having a more interesting future. It's not just about necessity or play money.
So, okay, the explicit 1950s ideal is mostly gone, even in our heads. Though maybe we romanticize the actual 50s too.
Sure.
But these underlying attitudes, these ghosts of gender roles, they still haunt the workplace. The chapter mentions Mad Men. Looks archaic, right? All that segregation and entitlement.
Totally.
But maybe seeing it so clearly in the past distracts us from how those same attitudes still clash with today's reality.
And that clash makes the workplace feel like a battleground sometimes. Women feeling unwelcome, facing discrimination, men feeling confused, defensive, like they're walking on eggshells.
This is where that list of subtle sexism comes in handy. From Nicole Benecratis.
Yes, it's really useful because it names these everyday things that maintain inequality, often without the person doing them even realizing it.
Like condescending chivalry.
Right. Holding back critique from a woman to protect her feelings, which actually holds her back professionally. Or supportive discouragement. Oh, are you sure you want that tough assignment? Maybe something less demanding.
Undermining confidence subtly.
Exactly. Friendly harassment, comments about appearance, maybe jokes that aren't overtly sexual but constantly mark her as other, as female first, worker second.
And collegial exclusion.
Scheduling important meetings or networking events at times known to conflict with family duties, like early mornings or late evenings, which disproportionately affects parents, often mothers. These aren't big dramatic acts, but they add up.
And this happens against a backdrop, in the U.S. at least, of high overall inequality.
Yes, high workplace gender inequality compared to other industrialized nations, and also high general income inequality. Top earners pulling away, while most people's wages have been flat since the 70s.
That stagnation puts extra pressure on men.
Right?
Especially if traditional male jobs are disappearing, that provider role feels even more precarious.
Definitely fuels anxiety and can make the changing workplace feel threatening.
Okay, let's shift from the subtle to the more overt. Discrimination. How does the chapter define it?
Basically, treating similar people differently or different people similarly when the differences don't actually matter for the situation. Legally, there's a key difference in the U.S.
Race versus gender.
Right. Race gets strict scrutiny. Discrimination based on race is almost always illegal. Gender gets intermediate scrutiny.
Meaning discrimination is allowed sometimes.
Yes, but only in very specific, exceptional circumstances. It can't be based on stereotypes, and there has to be what's called a bona fide occupational qualification, a BFOQ, a real essential job requirement.
So like you can say a 9-year-old can't be a lifeguard because age is relevant to the job's demands. That's a BFOQ.
Exactly. But arguing that being male or female is a BFOQ for most jobs, very difficult today.
That TWA case is a good example of not having a BFOQ.
Perfect example, asking a female applicant about her marriage plans, kids, pregnancy, questions a man would never be asked. That's treating similar applicants differently purely based on gender stereotypes. Clear discrimination.
But what about men trying to get into female jobs? The Hooters case.
Oh yes, Hooters. Men sued because they couldn't be waiters. Hooters' defense was basically that female sexuality or vicarious sexual recreation was the BFOQ. You had to be female to sell that.
Did that fly legally?
It was controversial. The case settled. Men got some bartender jobs, but not waiter jobs. It's a weird example, but shows how deeply gendered some jobs remain, even in legal arguments.
Okay, but maybe more common than that kind of overt case is sex segregation.
Much more pervasive. Men and women clustered in different jobs, different industries, different levels within companies. The sexual division of paid labor.
That feels natural almost. Like people just choose different paths.
That's how it looks. But the argument here is that segregation causes a lot of the inequality. It's not just a result of free choice. Get this statistic.
At me.
Fewer than 10% of Americans work with someone of the opposite sex doing the same job for the same boss, in the same place, on the same shift.
10%. That's staggering.
It is. We might work in roughly equal numbers overall now, but we go to very different workplaces to do very different things. Over half the workforce would need to change jobs just to achieve basic integration.
That childhood example really brings it home. Babysitting versus mowing lawns.
Yes, babysitting. Usually girls, lower pay, maybe $5 an hour back then. Mowing lawns or shoveling snow. Usually boys, much higher pay, maybe $20, $25 a house.
Sure, mowing is physical, but babysitting takes real skill too.
Absolutely. Social skills, nurturing, responsibility. And look what happens when adults do these jobs professionally. Nannies versus landscape workers. The pay can be much more comparable.
So the huge pay gap for the kids' jobs.
It strongly suggests it's tied to the gender of who does it, not just the inherent difficulty. Segregation, even in childhood, hides wage discrimination based on gender.
And this pattern just continues. The chapter calls segregation the single biggest cause of the pay gap.
Yep. Look at any list of jobs. Female-dominated fields like teaching, nursing, secretarial work consistently pay less than male-dominated fields like construction, mechanics, logging, even when skill levels might be comparable.
And women are still heavily concentrated in these female-dominated jobs.
Still, almost half of working women are in occupations that are over 75% female.
So is it just socialization, girls pushed one way, boys another?
That's part of it, sure. But the chapter argues it's not the whole story. Look internationally. The gender makeup of the same job varies wildly.
Like doctors.
Exactly. Mostly male in the U.S. historically, but in Russia, about half are women. Dentists. Male-dominated, high status in the U.S., more female-dominated, maybe less high status relative to other professions in parts of Europe. Firefighters in New York versus Minneapolis, different gender ratios.
So it can't just be innate preference if it changes that much based on location.
Right. It points to social factors, cultural norms, how jobs are structured in different places, and critically, that gender mix affects the pay.
More men, more pay.
Generally, yes. Male-dominated fields pay more, female-dominated fields pay less. That dentist comparison again, same work, different gender mix, different relative income. Suggests the pay is linked to the gender of the dentist, not just the dentistry itself.
The chapter also looks at jobs that change gender over time.
This is fascinating. Clerical work. Started out skilled, male, decent pay. Became female, reevaluated as less skilled, pay dropped. Veterinary medicine. Used to be mostly men, high pay relative to doctors. Became mostly women, pay fell relative to doctors. Computer programming. Initially seen as like key punching, lower status, often women. Men moved in, it got redefined as highly intellectual status and pay soared.
So the perceived value of the job shifts based on who's doing it.
Exactly. Charlotte Perkins Gilman pointed this out way back in the 1920s with things like childbirth and undertaking jobs literally changed hands from women to men. And the status and pay changed right along with them.
And the golf course study, that was wild.
Yes. The correlation between how far apart the men's and women's tees are and the local wage gap.
Further apart the tees, bigger the wage gap?
Yep. One interpretation, places, assuming women need more help on the course, have more patronizing views generally, depressing wages. But the other idea...
Informal networking.
Right. Closer tees mean men and women might ride in the golf cart together more often, have those casual chats, make connections that grease the wheels for careers. It's a clever way to show how even physical space and social interaction link to inequality.
So the core argument is women's jobs pay less, partly just because women do them.
That's a central claim. The gender of the worker influences the wage beyond just the job duties.
And the transgender wage study really nails this point.
It's incredibly powerful evidence. Female-to-male individuals. Wages often went up after transition, reported more respect. Male-to-female individuals. Wages dropped significantly, nearly a third, reported loss of authority, more harassment.
Same person, different perceived gender, totally different economic outcome.
Stark illustration of how gender itself carries economic value or penalty in the current system.
Okay, so segregation and these gender ideas lead directly to the wage gap. Income discrimination.
Yep. Women earn less than men, period. Starts early, too. The chapter mentions girls getting smaller allowances than boys, even in elementary school.
And segregation makes it hard to see, right? Looks like different jobs just pay differently.
Exactly. But often it's different genders being paid differently for work that might require very similar levels of skill or effort, just in segregated fields.
What are the overall numbers?
Back in 1999, women earned about 73 cents for every dollar a man earned, looking at full-time workers. By around 2008, it was up to about 77 cents.
So closing slightly.
Yes, but the chapter cautions that some of that closing wasn't just women's wages rising, it was also men's wages stagnating or even falling, especially in manufacturing. So not entirely a positive story.
Women still taking home significantly less each week. That pay inequity day idea.
Right, falling in early April symbolizes how far into the next year the average woman has to work to catch up to what the average man earned the previous year.
And over a lifetime, that adds up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars lost.
Yeah, the estimate was around $420,000 lifetime loss for the average working woman back then. Huge cumulative impact.
And race makes it even more complex.
Absolutely. Black and Hispanic men earn less than white men. Black and Hispanic women earn significantly less than white women, and often less than men in their own racial groups, though black women sometimes earn similarly to Hispanic men. It's layered inequality. The charts show it clearly.
And this gap, this ratio, it hasn't actually changed much historically.
Shockingly consistent. Since the Civil War, women's wages have stubbornly hovered between half and two-thirds of men's. Eerily close to that 60% value for female labor mentioned way back in biblical texts.
Wow. And the gap gets worse over a woman's career.
Dramatically worse. Starts relatively small for young workers, maybe women earning 93% of men's wages in their late teens, early 20s. But by the time they're in their late 50s, women are earning only 62% of what men their age earn.
Why does it widen so much?
Key factors are discrimination in promotions and raises over time, and the impact of taking time out, usually for children. Each child can cost a woman about 7% in wages, according to studies cited, and returning after leave often means lower pay than before. The penalties accumulate.
And that finding about men's attitudes affecting their pay.
Yeah, fascinating. Men holding traditional gender views earn more than men with egalitarian views, even controlling for other things. Suggests the system rewards traditional masculinity financially, even among men. Being egalitarian might actually cost men money.
Okay, so women get channeled into lower-paying jobs. And when they do get into better fields, they hit barriers moving up, the glass ceiling.
Right. You've got the sticky floor keeping women in low-wage roles, and the glass ceiling blocking qualified women and minorities from reaching senior management. Not because they aren't capable, but because of bias.
The government's own commission confirmed this back in the 90s.
Yep. Women were nearly half the workforce, getting over half the master's degrees, but held only a tiny percentage of top jobs. And the women who did make it earned much less than their male peers. The numbers haven't shifted all that much since.
The public's lawsuit really showed the stereotypes at play.
It did. Women denied promotions because managers thought they weren't capable, or because they were single mothers and not heads of household. Real biases with real consequences. The settlement was huge.
And the numbers at the very top, board seats. CEOs, still tiny percentages for women, especially women of color.
Dismal numbers. And it plays out in professions, too. MBA studies show women start behind in salary and the gap grows. Stanford MBA's huge difference in who becomes CEO a decade later. That Swedish study, same background, same ambition, but only the men got into top management. It's not about individual drive, it's the system.
What keeps the ceiling in place?
Lots of things. Poor diversity policies, biased evaluations, stereotypes, lack of family support.
But the biggest factor mentioned.
The informal stuff. The men's club atmosphere at the top. That manager quoted wanting people who provide comfort, chemistry, people who think like we do, which usually means people like them. Male, white. British studies found female MBAs saw that informal network as the #1 barrier.
And the Ann Hopkins case. Hopkins v. Price Waterhouse.
Classic example. Super successful bring in business, but denied partnership. Why? Too macho, too abrasive, told to wear makeup, walk more femininely.
The ultimate double bind.
Exactly. Be assertive and ambitious like a man to succeed, but then get penalized for not being feminine enough. Be feminine and you're seen as not having what it takes for leadership. Lose-lose. The cartoon captures it. Your career if you were a man.
The Civil Rights Act of '91 tried to address this, setting up the Glass Ceiling Commission.
Yeah, trying to tackle those biases, the old boys network. And some companies have made efforts. Reebok, Bank of Montreal, Lotus showing change is possible with real commitment.
Now, what about the glass cellar idea, that men are the real victims?
Warren Farrell's argument, mentioned in the text, men are stuck in the most dangerous jobs where most deaths happen.
How does the chapter respond to that?
Critically, it points out those dangerous jobs are male-dominated, partly because men have historically fought to keep women out of them, and those hazardous jobs often pay better than the safest female-dominated jobs. So the resistance isn't about protecting men, it's about protecting male domains, even dangerous ones, from female entry.
Okay, let's talk about tokens. What happens when you're one of the few?
Rosabeth Moss Cantor's concept. Tokens aren't just statistical minorities. They're often accepted because they're different, maybe discouraged from bringing in more like them. And they're hyper-aware of being seen as a representative.
Like being the only woman in a meeting and ask, what do women think about this?
Exactly. You become a symbol, not an individual. Cantor talked about hypervisibility, everyone's watching you, but also invisibility as a person. Your successes might be downplayed, failures amplified. It's exhausting.
Cantor thought this applied to any token group, but later research found a difference for men in women's fields.
Yes, Christine Williams's work on the glass escalator. It turns out men entering female-dominated fields, nursing, teaching, libraries, social work, often don't hit a ceiling.
They ride an escalator up.
Pretty much. They often get preferential treatment in hiring, get promoted faster, pushed into administration and management roles more often than their female colleagues.
So they actually benefit from being rare.
Often, yes. They tend to earn more and advance quicker within those fields, even if the pay overall isn't as high as traditionally male fields.
Do they face any downsides? Stereotypes.
Sure, from the public, maybe. Male nurses assumed to be gay, male librarians seen as wimpy. But the chapter notes these stereotypes can actually help the escalator effect.
Oh.
By making the most female-identified parts of the job seem less suitable for men, nudging them towards supervisory roles seen as more masculine or appropriate.
So men bring their gender privilege with them, even when they're the minority.
That's the argument. Rarity becomes an advantage, not a disadvantage. The system benefits men, majority or minority.
And this helps explain why some men might resist equality.
Yeah, Heidi Hartman's point. The system as is benefits men higher wages, the way domestic labor is divided. That privilege is often invisible to those who have it, so equality can feel like losing something you are entitled to. Reverse discrimination.
That talk show title, A Black Woman Stole My Job.
Perfect example of that entitlement. Question the word M. Why was it your job? Often, the answer lies in historical advantage, not pure merit. Competing on equal terms feels like a loss.
Another reason for resistance mentioned is the distraction argument.
Right. Women's presence disrupts male bonding, lowers standards, distracts men. You hear it in debates about the military, other male spaces.
But the counter is?
It's not women's presence per se, it's women's presence as equals. Men work alongside women all the time as subordinates or in different roles, doctors, nurses. The distraction seems to happen when women become peers, competitors, challenging the male hierarchy.
And this resistance connects directly to sexual harassment.
Yes, the chapter presents harassment as a key tool used by some men to police gender boundaries and resist equality. Its visibility increased because of more reporting, renaming old behaviors, and legal changes.
Legally recognized as discrimination back in the 70s. Title VII.
Thanks to Catherine McKinnon's arguments, creating a hostile environment based on sex is an illegal barrier to equality, just like racial harassment.
But the big public moment was Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas in '91.
Absolutely. Huge turning point. Despite how Hill was treated, it broke the silence. Thousands of women realized, that happened to me too. Cases filed with the EEOC skyrocketed. The country finally had a name for this widespread experience.
And the statistics show it is widespread.
Shockingly so. 50 to 85% of women reporting experiencing some form of it. Surveys consistently show high rates, from suggestive comments to actual assault. Even female lawyers reported high rates, though few filed complaints.
Where does it happen most often?
Interestingly, many EEOC cases come from blue-collar women, and harassment tends to be more frequent and severe in jobs just opening up to women, traditionally male domains like mining, construction.
Like the women are invaders.
Exactly. Harassment is used to drive them out, make them feel unwelcome. The Lois Jensen case, North Country, is a powerful example. Miners facing horrific abuse just for wanting a decent job, leading to that landmark class action suit.
What are the legal forms? Quid pro quo.
This for that, sex for a promotion, or to avoid being fired, like the Senator Packwood allegations.
And hostile environment.
More common, maybe murkier. A pattern of behavior jokes, comments, pictures, touching that makes the workplace intimidating or offensive. Doesn't have to be an explicit demand. Could be med students ignored or targeted with jokes, finding porn in anatomy slides, the ladies' days in law school, or the groping and graffiti in the Mitsubishi plant case.
And the key point is, it's usually not about sex or attraction.
Rarely. It's about power, dominance, exclusion, making women feel they don't belong, reminding them it's men's space.
Deborah Rhodes' quote, keeping women in their places and out of men's.
Exactly. Like street harassment, it's not usually about getting a date. It's about asserting control over the space, making women uncomfortable.
And in the workplace, now that women are there as colleagues, maybe even bosses,
Harassment becomes a way to put them back in their place, especially if men feel their own status is threatened. It's a way to reassert challenged male dominance.
and it works. It has real effects.
Definitely. Causes huge stress, health issues, women leave jobs, productivity drops. It's described as psychological rape. Happens most in newly integrated fields because that's where the male territory feels most invaded. Trying to scare women off a male preserve?
But it's complicated legally because perceptions differ.
Right. His harmless joke is her source of stress and humiliation. That's why the legal standards shifted.
From reasonable person to considering the reasonable woman.
Briefly, yes, in the Ellison v. Brady case, recognizing that a supposedly neutral standard often reflected male norms. The Supreme Court went back to a reasonable person, but the key takeaway stuck. What matters is the effect on the victim, not the intent of the harasser.
Which caused backlash from some men.
Yeah, feeling confused, defensive, what was normal is now illegal. That machinist during the Thomas hearing saying Thomas didn't do anything any American male hasn't done. Surveys showing men would be flattered by propositions. Big disconnect.
And the economic cost is huge too.
Millions lost every year from absenteeism, turnover, low morale, litigation. It's expensive for businesses and taxpayers.
Are men armed too?
Yes. Supervisors suffer from less productive teams. Positive working relationships get poisoned. And importantly, men harass other men too.
Really? Why?
Often targeting men perceived as not masculine enough gay men, or just men who don't fit the mold. It's about enforcing gender norms within the male group. Same-sex harassment is illegal too, and those cases are rising. It's a tool to keep everyone in their gender box.
Okay, so despite all this, segregation, pay gap, ceiling, harassment, women aren't leaving the workforce.
No way. They're there to stay. They work for the same reasons men do. Money, family support, satisfaction. And the reality for most families now is dual earners juggling work and home.
And the core argument of the last section is that this juggling act isn't just an individual failure, right?
Exactly. It's an institutional failure. The workplaces themselves haven't changed enough to match the reality of people's lives. The solution isn't just telling women to lean in harder or opt out smarter. It's about changing work itself.
So things like family-friendly policies.
Yeah, on-site childcare, flex time, parental leave, good for retention, good for morale, presented as good business.
But often framed as women's issues.
That's the critique. Books telling women to be more intentional, plan their families around careers. The chapter says that's only half right. It assumes men don't change, that the workplace doesn't change.
These should be parents' issues.
Exactly. Men need to use these policies too, not just to help out at home, but for the lives they say they want, lives with real family connection. Women have become private careerists, juggling family life privately. The call is for public fatherhood.
Men showing commitment to family in the workplace.
Yes, adjusting their own careers publicly. The Tony Blair example is perfect,
He took only 2 days leave.
despite his government bringing in parental leave, while his wife, the main earner, took her full leave. Public opinion was split. Support the idea, but maybe not for the PM, shows the huge attitudinal barriers.
Which leads to the problem. Policies exist, but people are afraid to use them.
Especially men. Fear of being seen as uncommitted, mommy-tracked, less masculine, threatening their advancement. Quotes in the chapter show this: the policy exists, but you can't really use it. People facing negative reactions for asking for flexibility.
So real balance benefits women.
Definitely. Working mothers often happier, more productive, preserves identity, but it needs real change from men equal share of home childcare, not just helping.
And it benefits men too.
Allows them the fuller lives many say they desire, not just the absent breadwinner.
Beyond family policies, what about legal fixes?
Strong enforcement of Equal Pay Act, Title VII, the EEOC's work. The chapter notes discrimination charges went up after the Hill hearings awareness matters.
But equal pay for the same job isn't enough because of segregation.
Which is why the chapter pushes for comparable worth.
paying dissimilar jobs the same if they have equivalent value.
Exactly. Requires systematic job evaluation skills, effort, responsibility, conditions, including those invisible skills often found in women's jobs, like emotional labor.
What about the arguments against it? Too complex. Kills the market.
The chapter refutes those. Companies do job evaluations anyway. The market is already biased. It's not rigid wage setting. And boosting women's earnings helps the whole economy.
What about things like affirmative action?
Presented as necessary, though controversial, to level a playing field that's historically tilted. The counter to the "it's demeaning" argument is that being denied opportunities based on your group is far more demeaning.
And tackling the mommy track.
Means changing how work is structured, like billable hours that penalize any time off, even though pregnancy discrimination itself is illegal. The US FMLA offers unpaid leave, which is something, but way behind paid leave in places like Scandinavia.
Might need government push, like board quotas in Europe.
The chapter suggests it might because voluntary change is slow.
And it's actually good business to promote women.
Studies show companies with more women leaders often perform better financially. It's smart strategy, not just fairness.
So the ultimate solution requires changing both minds and structures.
Yep. Shifting ideologies, moving past stereotypes, Mars-Venus thinking, and reforming structures, social policies that assume family equality, truly flexible work, union support, fair tax policies.
It's about ending the overall separateness of men's and women's lives, as Karen Oppenheim-Mason puts it.
Because workplace inequality is just one piece of that larger picture.
But the goal is worthwhile, more fulfilling lives for everyone.
So we've really dug into how the workplace, this space we think of as merit-based, is just deeply shaped by gender, from who does what job to how much they earn to how they're treated day to day.
Yeah, and the inequalities stick around, not despite women entering, but almost because the structures and ideas haven't caught up. It's like the system has inertia.
It really challenges that simple idea that success is just about individual talent and hard work. Gender is always there, playing a role, often invisibly.
So maybe the final thought to leave people with, the provocative one from this deep dive. If the system, like this chapter suggests, gives men advantages they often don't even see, and maybe even penalizes men who try to be more egalitarian or enter female fields, what would real equality actually require everyone, men and women, to, well, maybe give up? And what could we all gain?
That's the big question, isn't it? Something to chew on. Maybe, start noticing the gender patterns in jobs around you. Look up comparable worth in your own area. Think about how these dynamics might have played out in your own life.
Definitely food for thought. We hope this deep dive gave you some new angles, maybe shook up a few assumptions.
Yeah.
Until the next chapter, keep diving deep.